Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are or if you're watching this on demand. Welcome to the How to Create a Streamlined Incident Management Runbook, the workshop. We are so thrilled that you are here. We are so thrilled to be here. We have the next 60 minutes together. I want to go ahead and point out some housekeeping features. So we do have the chat that folks are already utilizing to have a bit of conversation. Feel free to throw an intro or a greeting or a comment in there. And then if you do have a more formal question for our speakers, go ahead and use the Q&A feature. And we will be sure to answer that either throughout the relevant section or at the end. Next, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers on the next slide. So this workshop will be led by Paul Chu, who is our Manager of Solution Engineering and Customer Success here at Blameless, as well as Nick Mason, who is a Solutions Engineer here at Blameless. With the two of these folks, you could probably not be in better hands. They have countless hours of working with Blameless customers and folks just like you who are working on and improving their incident management runbook. And my name is Sarah Perry. I am in growth on the marketing team here at Blameless. So I will go ahead and introduce some of the topics that we'll be discussing today. We're going to start with a basic definition. So this workshop is all about a runbook. We're going to start with defining and getting on the same page about what that is. Then we'll move into incident response. So we're going to be talking about what workflow steps actually make up an effective incident management runbook, as well as incident classification, working on how to define severity levels, what roles do I need to assign folks who are responding to an incident, and then what tasks do they need to be assigned. We'll go through all of that, and then we'll move into retrospectives. So we'll be discussing after an incident, how do we get started on an effective and meaningful retrospective? How do we build a cultural foundation that is going to lead to a retrospective where everyone learns from an incident? And then we'll be throwing in some goodies throughout the event as well. So we'll be able to share our retrospective template outline. We will be polling throughout. So we will be utilizing Zoom's poll feature to ask some probing questions and get a pulse for where the audience is at. So next I'll go into our incident management runbook definition. So we know that at different organizations, at different companies, you may be utilizing runbooks in a different way. So we all want to get on the same page about what the definition of a runbook is for today. A runbook is a detailed how-to guide for completing a commonly repeated task or procedure within a team's process. Runbooks are created to provide everyone on the team, new or experienced, the knowledge and steps to quickly and accurately resolve a given issue. Now, based on that working definition of a runbook, I do want to launch our first interactive poll. So our question to start us off today, do you have an agreed upon runbook for incident management written down today? And you'll see the poll show up on your screen here and go ahead and select the answer that works for you. I'll give folks a couple more seconds here. Okay, if you haven't answered yet, 3, 2, 1, and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so 59% of folks do have an agreed upon runbook. That is great news. Some folks do not, and maybe that's why you're here. We'd love to know. And some folks may not know. And it's great to know and start with, where are we really at? So let's get into this workshop so that we can get a little further along in these runbooks. Today, you will leave today's session with why a codified incident management runbook matters. So there's a reason that this workshop is focused on that runbook specifically. We'll leave with best practices and templates for on-call for responders in any role, why retrospectives are critical to learning and improving, and how to make a good one. Understanding why culture plays a big part. It's not just about adopting the right tools. It's not just about writing down a runbook. It's also about that team culture, right? And then we'll learn about the intersection of runbooks, tooling, and integrations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Paul Chu.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our workshop today. I'm just going to build up the slide real quick. All right. And just to reiterate, we want to keep this interactive, and we have those polls in there for folks to participate in. But if you do have any questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A or into the chat, whatever is easier for you. I do have it open here on my second screen, so I'll keep an eye on it along with my colleagues here. And we'll be able to answer those questions as we go through. Will the slide, so I see the first question, will the slide deck be available after the webinar? You most certainly could. We could create a PDF, and since we have your all emails, we can go and send that out to you if you'd like. Okay, so I'm going to start high level, just talk about the structure of the incidents, and then dive right into the incident management, incident response portion of the workshop today. So whether you follow DevOps principles or SRE principles, or who knows, maybe you found something that's cutting edge and super viral, maybe that you discuss with some of your colleagues in the space. The one thing that is always constant is reliability for engineering orgs. So we here at Blameless have that in mind when we've built out our application. So we really want to incorporate a holistic approach when it comes to not only incident response and retrospectives, but also things like service registry, SLOs, and insights. So whether you have something like service registry in place or not, we obviously are working towards and have functionality in our product to really help kind of consolidate that information and make it so you set those expectations along different teams and different organizations within your company. SLOs, of course, is another piece that we'll kind of touch upon, but won't dive into today. And then, of course, the insights, which is more around how you can kind of monitor and learn, see how your teams are doing overall regarding reliability. So again, just to reiterate, we'll be focusing on the incident response and retrospective piece for today's workshop. Okay, so as you climb this proverbial mountain, as we say, you'll quickly realize that, and quite obviously, in order to get to the top, you got to start at base camp, right? And you'll see here with the base of the mountain, we have incident response and retrospectives. You could start with culture potentially. I think that's one of the pieces where you can kind of reorder if you'd like. But one example is that you'll most likely never start with SLOs as an example, because that's one of those things where it's an indicator in terms of how you should prioritize your work, and it eventually leads back down to the incident response and, of course, retrospectives as well. So as you kind of know more about your incidents, the types of incidents you're seeing, the severity levels and all that, and of course, how you collaborate, the absolute key thing to keep in mind as you achieve a higher level of reliability is this sort of foundation, the blocking and tackling, so to speak, and ultimately helping you achieve what Liz Fung Jones would refer to as production excellence. So looking at the incident runbook, we break it down typically into three different components. The first is going to be sort of a role-based sort of task list and responsibilities as you enter into an incident. We'll also look at the incident tech stack that you're leveraging today and also how they're being leveraged during the incident. And then, of course, with all that information that you've gathered, summarizing that all up into a single, easy to digest document, which we'll, of course, refer to as a retrospective, and then really taking that and distilling that into learnings. In terms of the tech stack, you're probably very familiar with a lot of the apps that are shown here on this slide, and probably are currently using them in your incident workflow today. So one of the things that we want to do here at Blameless is really be able to orchestrate those actions during your incident across your existing applications. And essentially, by doing so, we want to help augment your existing process and take it further than just a document that you could refer to, plus some other sort of kind of build it yourself sort of automations and streamlining that you're doing today. But overall, as I'm sure many of y'all know, this can be very overwhelming, right? Especially, I think I saw over 50% have incident processes documented today. But of course, when you do get into the incident, you'll learn, right? You'll understand kind of where the gaps are, where you can improve. But of course, it's still overwhelming in terms of understanding where and knowing kind of where to find that information across these different applications. All right, I'm going to build up this slide. Great. So at a high level, this kind of graph is going to be close to what your incident process will look like. And you'll see that things might be working for you today, but as you start to kind of continue to iterate, continue to invest in this process, in this program, you'll quickly see that establishing these sort of protocols at the very beginning, or at least stopping and establishing those protocols, will go a long way, especially if you're a smaller, leaner team, rapidly growing, because you're so successful with your application, of course. Sometimes it helps to slow things down in order to go fast. That's something that one of my friends and colleagues would tell me too. And that applies to anything. So you could take that for anything you want. All right. So before we jump into the workshop portion, I do want to provide some anecdotes from a couple of our customers here at Blameless, one from Flatiron and the other from Machinify. So I'll let y'all read the two quotes here, but starting with the Flatiron quote, the individual here I've worked with very closely from the pre-sales all the way through as a customer. But a few kind of key points that he mentioned was that when he enters in incidents, he definitely feels less anxious, less anxiety when he enters that, knowing that there is some sort of process in place. That leads to sort of that peace of mind with the orchestration that they're able to implement with all their different tools using Blameless. And then, of course, from a people perspective, it really sets clear expectations across the board. So that way, we're really reducing as much confusion as we can, really controlling what we can in this uncontrollable situation. On the Machinify side, just to echo what we just kind of went through with Flatiron, it's really about the expectation setting. I think a lot of times, and you'll see this as we go deeper into the various roles, the various aspects of incident response, it's really about expectation setting to really help reduce a lot of the confusion as you go through. We also have a link here that we'll post into the chat if you love to read or just want to skim through this as well. This is just to reiterate sort of that expectation setting, who needs to be involved with these incidents. So take a look at that when you get a chance. All right. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the meat of things here. I do want to pose a couple questions just to keep in mind as we're going through this portion of the workshop, just so you can kind of position yourself mentally on this. So the first question that I have for the audience today is, how successful is your incident response today? What are some of the challenges that you face today with that current process? And what expectations are you held to with your current process? So keep those in mind as we're going through. And then if you do have any additional questions, please throw those into the Q&A or the chat. Okay, so jumping into the first topic here. So we talked about expectation a lot. One of the first things that'll help set those expectations across the various teams is severity. So severity is definitely one of those things that if you have today loosely, it definitely gives some sort of frame of reference for the folks who are joining the incident. But I think the few things, or the couple of things rather, that really severity levels help set in terms of expectations are resources as the first item. So who needs to be involved? When do they need to be involved? According to the severity levels set for these incidents. The second piece that this helps set expectations for is prioritization. Everyone has their plate of work. They have their plans, sort of goals and objectives that they need to meet. So is this incident something that can be prioritized over that without having to justify or make these decisions on the fly? So resources and prioritization are two things that this will certainly help with. One other question you might have is, why does it matter if you're categorizing these incidents? So severity is one of those pieces. We'll get into the other piece with different incident types. So that's kind of what we have for severity levels here. I do see a question in the chat. So how does Blameless define success? You're going to love my answer, Eric. It depends. So it really depends on what your business is focusing on, and also what stage of the business you're at, right? So I think one of the things, if you're kind of a smaller organization with a leaner team, it's all about just making sure that your application is back to a state where customers are happy. At that point, you're focused on just onboarding new users, getting feedback. So you really want to focus on that piece. As you grow larger, and you could do this early on as well, those sort of success criteria could shift and change, right? As your sales teams become more predictable in terms of, how much business they're closing, or we have a more predictable roadmap, right? Those can help kind of shift the success from an incident management standpoint, because at that point, you might have more defined SLAs that you'll have to meet for your customers without having some sort of penalty being incurred. So it depends. And I think you probably have some ideas as well. So I'd totally be happy to have that conversation on a separate session too, if you'd like. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so incident status templates. So this is one of the other areas where it's going to help sort of break down the incident. And by doing so, this really helps make the incident more manageable. So as you're going through these incidents, here's a kind of example of how we do it today, both internally and within our product. But you'll notice that each of these different statuses will have various tasks associated. So depending on where you're at in the incident, it's good to have a lot of these sort of standardized practices. And that way, you can really be laser focused on working on the issue at hand while making sure that you're following a lot of these steps that you've already defined. The other piece too is that we'll have different roles associated as well with these various tasks. So that way, you'll have that ownership, which we'll get into here in a second as well. But this can lead to anything from internal kind of resource allocation to when and how you notify internal customers, external customers. So this is going to really help kind of make that process much more repeatable. Okay, so just want to give you some sort of I guess some context or conceptualize what we've talked about so far. So within our product, you'll see some kind of screenshots here. We have the same concept around setting those expectations when it comes to configuring your incident runbooks. So once an incident is declared, you have that type and severity to really be able to dictate how the team will be able to mobilize and what they need to focus on at various aspects and timings of the incident. But by doing so, and having these sort of configurations already set prior to an incident, this essentially answers the following questions that you see on your screen. So who needs to be involved? Those members, should they be automatically invited into the channel? Should they be notified via Slack? That's something that you can go ahead and incorporate as a part of the workflow. What roles are needing to be assigned? So that's going to allow you to really set those expectations again in terms of who owns what tasks need to be completed, right? These are going to be presented to those roles as they get delegated out. Coming back to communications, what channels you have to notify. You need to update the engineering team, for example, once this incident starts, or you have to notify your leadership team. And then lastly, what data does the team need to gather? So what metrics are important? And to your question, Eric, this is essentially where you as an organization will come in and start to understand, as you mature and iterate, kind of what metrics you're looking to keep an eye on to really be able to leverage this to make decisions in the future. So there are a lot of questions, right? As you kind of see these incidents come up, and as you can imagine, they could contribute to a ton of cognitive overhead, right? So by having this pre-configured, again, slowing down in order to go fast, this will really help provide that structure, that foundation. So when you do deal with incidents, you're controlling what you can control, and then the rest, you'll be able to work through it together. And who knows, maybe sprinkle in a couple tabletops or 2 per quarter. That always helps. Okay, the next piece is around incident roles. So for incident roles, you most likely have a high level kind of semblance of this at your organization today. But at the end of the day, having roles during the incident process helps establish ground rules. One of the more commonly used kind of methodologies or philosophies around incident management is ICS, or the Incident Command System, which, for those who are familiar and for those who aren't, was established in 1968 by the fire chiefs in Southern California to help with fighting wildfires. So that was so successful in terms of the structure of the roles that the U.S. government also implemented that in various agencies and areas of the U.S. government to have some level of training for this, so that whenever they do have incidents, again, those ground rules are set. One of the main things that I found that really stuck out to me as I was reading up on the ICS methodology is that the first arriving unit or officer will establish command until someone higher or a higher ranking officer arrives at the scene, right? And this, I think, applies to each and every one of us, right? You see an incident, you see an alert come through, you kind of start it, you triage it, you try to validate what's going on. But from there, you're going to take over that incident until someone else comes in who maybe you might ping via on call or whatever the case may be. But that sort of methodology really helps establish those ground rules, which I'll get into here in more detail. So if you look at the graphic here, it's essentially showing three main roles or category of roles, if you will. The commander will be here at the top. They're the ones who'll be coordinating, kind of overseeing the incident, working closely with the communications lead, as well as those kind of working on the issue at hand, but really keeping more of a high level view of the incident. So that way, when folks or the team do kind of go a little too deep or a little too long in kind of one potential area that they need to fix, it's someone like the commander's there to kind of help pull them out and kind of focus on the bigger picture and how much time we spent on it. So by having this chain of command, it really allows for each individual to be able to do their role very effectively. A lot of times, you might find yourself as the commander, the communication lead, and the subject matter expert for these incidents. And I'm sure you've had many situations where you're working on the incident, someone pings you for an update, you get interrupted, you give them the update maybe 5-10 minutes later, and then you go back to the incident and you're kind of lost on where you kind of left off at, right? And then if you want to bring other folks in, again, it's very tough to coordinate in that sense. So that's really where the incident roles become an important factor. It's not going to be perfect, of course, and there will be situations where you might have to take multiple roles. But the main point is that if you are able to establish these kind of set expectations from the very beginning, you can obviously deviate from that depending on what the situation calls for. So diving into the individual role a little bit deeper, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. So the incident commander, and you can kind of read through the table here, but the main items that I like to focus on is that the role of the incident commander is to stay aware of the situation so that they can adjust kind of the direction they're going if needed. The next is making sure that the right folks are involved. So that way, as people are coming in, the commander can delegate out those specific roles to those individuals. And that way they'll know kind of based off of their tasks what they need to do. Knowing when it's appropriate to escalate. We'll get into culture, but one of the things around kind of escalating incidents is folks are kind of unsure on whether they should or could actually escalate this and if they're following the right process. So having someone like the incident commander to make that call for the group makes it much easier and much more efficient as well. And then, of course, keeping an eye on time and the resources spent. That way you can avoid potential burnout for individuals too. The incident communicator. So this is going to be the individual who acts as the liaison between the incident team / commander and everyone else. This is going to really help control the amount of inbound sort of requests and questions, especially for those higher severity incidents. So by having someone like this in this sort of communicator role really will help kind of filter out the noise, kind of act as kind of the spokesperson, so to speak, for the incident and allow for everyone else to be able to work on the incident. One of the areas here that I like to highlight is that this is definitely an issue we hear a lot here at Blameless. So we do have a feature called Comms Flow, which is meant to help essentially orchestrate a lot of the incident communications,
based off of your use cases. So if you're curious, that piques your interest, we're obviously here. Let us know, and we'll be happy to have another session there. And then for our last slide for roles, this is kind of at a high level, an example of a progression of established steps in order to validate the incident, right? You starting from left to right, you'll have the alert come in, the on-call team jumps on it right away. They'll look at it, they'll start to triage and gather data. And then once they're at a validated state, they'll go and declare the incident, specify the type, the severity, and get that kicked off. The IC will then come into the mix, whether you have a dedicated on-call rotation for your incident commanders, or they're on the on-call rotation as well. That will obviously differ based off of how you establish that at your organization. That, again, that individual, as we just went through in depth here, is going to be the one kind of at the top, understanding kind of what the situation is and how to pivot when needed. And then everyone else will then be able to focus on what they need to focus on, right? You bring in various SMEs to look at various aspects of this incident, so they don't have to work, they don't have to be interrupted in terms of what they're investigating, what they're working on. That way, again, just to help set those ground rules, make the whole process much more efficient as well. So again, just to give you some context and be able to conceptualize this, this is what it looks like in Blameless today. So that way, based off of the things like severity levels, incident types, this is kind of an example of how you might have it today, as well as how an application could potentially present this as well. But we want to keep you in Slack, so you'll see here that these different tasks are from the incident Slack channel. You'll have the timeline there in the back to help gather a lot of those pertinent details as well. So these are some of the things that we can do here at Blameless to really help automate and augment your incident management process. And then continuing on, what do individuals see? Again, we look at the tasks, we look at the different abilities to add additional data, additional metadata to make sure that we can then report off of these as well in the future. But really, again, just to help streamline and provide a consistent, repeatable process when it comes to these incidents. Okay, so do you see a question here? When do you see an incident commander getting involved with an on-call team? For example, do you automatically let an incident commander know for every severity level of an incident? That is a great question. So from my experience, depending on your resourcing in terms of number of teams, number of individuals, getting an incident commander involved at the very beginning for all incidents, I would say is a good default to start with. And then of course you can iterate based off of the number of incident commanders you might have available, or the number of incidents as an example too, which you might then have to potentially expand out to a larger team. But having an incident commander involved for all incidents, again, just helps kind of move the incident forward. Even if you look at this workshop, for example, right? If I were to ask a question and saying, who here knows X, Y, and Z? There's this mentality where folks might not jump in automatically or right away, because you're kind of like, who's gonna answer first, right? So by having this established role with an incident commander at the very beginning, just helps kind of get rid of those gaps of time. It could be a couple minutes, it could be 10 minutes, doesn't really matter, but over the course of the incident, it could be a significant amount of time. So that's the way I see it as a default. But of course, there are a lot of things to consider as you kind of approach that. A couple of things I'll mention there is that the incident commander role has a level of authority, right? So I think one of the things that I've seen is successful is leverage those folks or those individuals at your organization who already have that level of authority, like a manager or whatever the case may be. And that way, it's much easier for folks to fall in line and saying, okay, this manager is telling us, let's go ahead and do this, right? I don't need to explain to my manager why I'm jumping on this. We had the incident commander go ahead and do that. So that's kind of where I would start. And then, you could expand out based off of an opt-in sort of process if you like as well. Cool. So this is my last slide before we jump into the poll, but I do have a couple more questions that I do want to pose. I think just for the sake of time, I'm not going to kind of have a small discussion around this, but some things to keep in mind is what makes following a runbook difficult. right? What can you make this easier? So think about kind of what we've covered today and use this as kind of an opportunity to, you have blocked off time to start thinking about some of these ideas and start writing those down and maybe discuss with your team. One other thing to consider as well is there an owner for your incident response process or program? So depending on the size of your organization, you may have a team who could program manage incident response, or you may not, right? But at the end of the day, if you do have someone who's dedicated and this is one of their core functions, of course, you'll see much more success since you have someone kind of keeping an eye on the process, making sure that folks are staying within these guardrails. For smaller organizations, of course, you might not have that that luxury of having a dedicated team or a dedicated individual. So that's really where you have a lot more of a shared ownership with this process. And of course, you can iterate iterate into the future as you go through as well. Cool. Hopefully everyone was following. So we'll jump into our next poll question here. So for your on-call schedule, do you have defined roles and responsibilities today? You should see the poll pop up. Go ahead and answer the question, and we'll give it about 15 seconds, and we'll go ahead and see the results. All right, 5 more seconds. And time. Let's see what we got. Interesting. So it's pretty evenly dispersed. We have the majority of the responses being a sort of. So I think, you know, the roles and responsibilities is definitely one of those things where it's a best practice. You'll realize kind of the benefits later down the line, but again, it's one of those things that you just have to kind of work through and document as well. But very interesting. Thank you, everyone. We have one last poll question before I jump into Nick's portion of the workshop. So poll number 3 is, do on-call team members know exactly when to escalate or pull in other SMEs? About 10 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and time. No surprise. I think the majority said sort of. So again, like, this is one of those areas where I think incident management, incident response is, people are thrown into it. A lot of times we realize where the improvements need to be made are, but it's very hard to kind of juggle that with your normal kind of day-to-day core responsibilities. So you're not alone. Obviously, this workshop is here to really help address some of those key topics. But yeah, thank you for answering those poll questions. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing well. The next section that we're going to be focusing on is, now that we have this great foundation that Paul talked about related to incident management, how you could set up your roles and tasks, have that accountability, ultimately following that process, let's talk about what a retrospective or this post-incident analysis looks like. So what information will we be gathering during the incident? How will we utilize that information? And then ultimately leading into the second part of what I'll be discussing with you all today is, how do retrospectives actually help when creating this idea of a blameless culture? And if you're thinking to yourself right now, Nick, what is a blameless culture? No worries. This is something that we're going to be discussing here. It's definitely a shift in thinking, but it's something that is definitely really related to retrospectives closely in installing a really positive culture within your organization when it comes to your incident management program and beyond. So we'll go ahead and we'll talk about those today. But moving into the next slide here, a couple, just like Paul did, I'd like you to really kind of focus and think about a couple questions as I'm getting started here. So like, why should you actually complete retrospectives? And how can you successfully make those a part of your process today? Oftentimes what I've heard based on talking to prospects kind of before using Blameless is, retrospectives are often overlooked when it comes to incident management as a whole. I've heard in the past that, teams spend so much time troubleshooting and trying to solve the problem at hand that documenting and having another meeting after you're all tired and worn out from solving the problem is just viewed more as a chore rather than a benefit. You could almost think about it like documenting your code. We've all been there before, I'm sure. No one likes doing it, but it's definitely an important part of maintaining a clean software environment. But the reality is of completing retrospectives or your post-incident analysis is that, based on my experience, if done properly and consistently, a blameless retrospective is, your vehicle in order to drive process improvements and this cultural change that we're talking about here. So I have 2 quotes up here on the screen. I want to just start by, going over what these actually mean. These will be important kind of moving forward. Both from one of our customers, Machinify. I'm going to actually read them out because I do think that they set a great foundation in terms of what we'll be discussing next. So using a tool like Blameless allows me to build a case with hard data to say, I need to fix this. And the second saying, this is a way to focus on getting to the true cause of something. So as we go to the next slide, keep those in mind, and we'll come back and we'll take a look at what are the real contributing factors here. But moving next, I'd like to do a little level setting before we go ahead and continue and just ask the question, how often do you actually produce retrospectives reports? So we'll go ahead, we'll take about 10 seconds to answer this poll question. This is always a question that I get varying results on, so it'll be interesting to see how everybody answers this one here. So we'll give another 3, 2, 1, and we will see how we did here. And again, just as I mentioned beforehand, it looks like the results are all across the board. I love the answer, what is a retrospective? That's exactly why we're here today, to talk about it. Some people do these post-incident analysis on a per incident basis. Sometimes it's kind of done ad hoc. And we're going to talk about why it's important to actually be going through and discussing this. So if we go into the next slide, we're really going to start talking about why retrospectives. But I'd like to come back and think about those quotes that we heard. And I want to focus on 2 key components of those quotes. Building a case with hard data. Hard data is the first key I want to point out. And getting to the true cause of something. And this is exactly why retrospectives are so powerful. So let's go ahead and answer that question, why retrospectives? The way that I think about this is you could really break this down into 2 key groups when it comes to why a retrospective is so powerful. So you could start by thinking about the technical evaluation. So what series, what services or products were impacted? What did we learn when, and what technical initiatives do we put in place kind of as follow-up actions to make sure that these systems don't go down again? This will ultimately help you avoid repeat incidents and help strengthen your defenses in the future. So obviously, understanding what the problem was, what was the technical solution is important, but the cultural evaluation, that's the second point I'd like to talk about here, is just as important. So making sure that, the process, as Paul talked about earlier, is tracking well with the team that's actually fighting the battle. So getting the right information to the right people at the right time is really the moral of the story here. There are other stakeholders outside of your incident management program and engineering teams that need to be aware and notified that something is happening. And what I've found to be quite useful is creating a structured list of questions aimed to help gauge how your process is working for the team today. So answering questions like, are the right individuals or groups automatically being brought in to help you solve the problem? If not, who did you need to bring in? Was there automated forms of communication being sent out to the right channels or teams, as Paul mentioned before, utilizing something like Blameless's comms flow feature? How did you feel about being brought into this incident? Did you feel like you had the right resources? Were you tired? Did you feel like you were kind of brought into this not at the right time? These are all valuable insights that will help you kind of drive that cultural change. So now that we've kind of talked about why retrospectives, let's get into the next section here of understanding how do you actually get started. And I recognize that just like we saw with the poll question out there, some teams are doing this for every single incident. Some don't even know what a retrospective is. Some may have templates that you're using with predetermined questions that you want to report on, and some may not have anything out there. This is all okay. And this is why we're going to be talking about kind of like what is the foundation for you to actually get started with your retrospective process. So at a high level, best practices to get started would be understanding who's going to actually be organizing and taking ownership of this retrospective. So as Paul mentioned before, coming back to that incident commander role, they're in charge of orchestrating the incident, ultimately moving this towards resolution. This person has, full eyes end to end of the entire incident from start to finish. So best practice that we've seen is that usually the incident commander is the one who is responsible for completing the retrospective. However, this is up to you and the team, and a tool like Blameless gives you that flexibility. Other practices that I've personally seen is maybe it's an engineering lead who kind of comes in and takes ownership of the retro. They obviously were the one that was in charge of, performing the mitigation steps and documenting what actually happened from a technical perspective. So they have the biggest visibility in terms of how can I answer the questions in order to make sure we're able to learn from this. But just as important as knowing who's going to take ownership next, it is best to identify, what type of retrospective you're actually completing. So again, coming back to that poll question, you saw some people do it every time. Some people do it on a per incident basis. And that's typically because of this idea of priority. So the Blameless team, we always recommend that you complete a retrospective anytime that you have an incident because it acts as this vehicle of learning and cultural change, as we're talking about right now. But again, you could determine if a retrospective is needed depending on the priority of the incident. So as an example, maybe a severity 3 versus a severity 0. Sev 0 is going to be much more of a high stakes. You're definitely going to want to perform that retrospective versus a Sev 3. Maybe it wasn't actually an incident, but you just want to jot down, maybe why it wasn't an incident. My recommendation is always complete a retrospective no matter what the priority is, but modify how you actually detail the information that you're gathering based on that priority. You could templatize different retrospective templates based on the incident type, so the problem that you're dealing with, and their corresponding severity labels, as Paul mentioned earlier. And the last piece here I'd really like to spend some time on is use the priority as a way of knowing how much time you actually need to get the retrospective done. So sometimes you need to get right into the write-up with the team, hop on a Zoom call, gather around your collaborative text editor, and start working on it, right? And other times you could take a breather and come back to it the next day. Some best practices that I've seen our customers do is maybe they have a meeting once a week where they go over all of the incidents and they'll sit down for an hour and they'll complete the retrospective and talk about it live. What went well, what didn't went well, what can we improve upon? But the moral of the story here is that you should be utilizing all of the resources that you've put in place during your configuration in order to help you know when you need to get the retrospective done and what details you need to have. The last point on this slide that I'd really like to focus on is this quote over here on the right from one of our customers, Zoopla. I'm going to read it out because I think that this is going to be very important moving into our next slides here. Blameless has helped us simplify the process. It has changed our culture and encourages involvement and collaboration around failures. So remember the idea of culture and collaboration around failures. Those are the two areas that I'd like to kind of make sure that you're thinking about as we move into the next slide here. So
one thing, if I may, Nick, is I think a lot of this is ideal state. We acknowledge, right, doing retrospectives for all incidents or only certain severity level of incidents. But this is where, depending on your resources or the size of your organization, right, you either have someone owning this program so that these sorts of things are getting done, or it's a shared ownership, right?
Exactly.
Maybe one day one person kind of says, hey, what's the status of this retrospective? Another day someone else does, right? But I think this is going to lead beautifully into Nick's culture portion of the workshop.
Yeah, definitely, Paul. And I think too, the other thing there is what this does is kind of, it gives you an area where, oftentimes people come in and start asking questions outside of the incident management team. The retrospective kind of groundwork gives them an area where they can come in and start reading rather than taking the team away from, working on the next incident or, taking a look at those follow-up actions as part of the results. So
Great point.
But yeah, coming back into this, the key from that quote that I just talked about was changing culture and encouraging involvement and collaboration around failures. And this really leads into what we're seeing here on the slide. You may be asking yourself, what is blamelessness? We talked about a blameless culture, blameless retrospectives, and blamelessness is not about avoiding blame, but it's about being empty of it. And what does that actually mean? The way that you set up your incident management program and retrospective reviews needs to be in a way where the team feels like they're being heard and not put at fault. And I think that's a really important aspect to think about when you're driving towards this cultural shift. Every incident is an opportunity to learn. I'm going to say this over and over and over again, but having this blameless environment to get feedback on what's working and what's not working is going to help you in your favor over time to actually make those small iterative changes and actually grow that process. And a couple questions that I'd like to pose and get you all thinking about is, why does blame actually exist? How does this actually have an impact on our organization or our incident response program? And then secondly, how can we actually avoid this blame? And like anything, blame exists everywhere that we work. It's a natural part of stress. You're working on complex problem solving. There's a lot on our plate. But the idea here is that rather than pointing fingers when something goes wrong, gathering the information, communicating to the right people, and documenting and having a mature conversation around what happened and how can we avoid this in the future is how we lead towards this idea of blamelessness. So a question I see here in the chat is, how important are severity level labels? For example, a couple of companies I've been at, the highest is Sev 1, equated to Sev 0. Does one need to try and move the Sev 0 definition, or is this more cosmetic? Great question. It's more of a cosmetic. So we have some customers that label P1 through P4. Maybe it's low, medium, high, highest. We have some where they just use 2 severity labels. But the idea really is of just saying like how important is actually solving this problem and how fast you actually have to get to it. Anything else you'd like to add there, Paul?
Yeah, I was just going to say that one benefit of using something that's sort of standardized is, when your team grows or new folks join your company, if you have Sev 0 as your highest and they are used to Sev 0 at their previous company, it just makes it very easy for them to quickly get the context. But regardless, to Nick's point, it doesn't really matter. You could use red, yellow, green. You could use A, B, C, D, right? Whatever makes sense as a part of your company culture, I think is definitely going to help determine those labels. But at the very least, if you have it documented, it makes it very easy for you to then, hey, check out how we have our severity labels defined. And that way you can kind of get everyone on board in terms of expectations.
Yep. Great question. So moving into this next slide here, as I mentioned before, it's okay if you're kind of thinking to yourself, yes, we have kind of this, we point the fingers today. This isn't going to be something that you're going to change overnight. But the idea here is that you really want to cultivate this safe environment to be vulnerable, have a mature conversation around what's happening, because these will ultimately help you make those small gradual changes over time. The biggest thing here is that you want your employees to be felt like they're heard. The team that is there battling the problem is going to be your first stop when, kind of cultivating this information. How can my processes change? And remember, struggling is okay. If you're here and you've answered some of the questions, like we don't have any of this in place today, this is perfectly okay. It's meant to be iterative. Start small, make those small changes over time, and continue to make sure that you're following the process. Trusting the process, as Paul kind of laid out earlier, is definitely key because you'll be able to learn what's working and what's not working. So now that we've kind of talked about, what the culture looks like and why retrospectives are important, let's talk about what makes up a good retrospective. What details do we need to have as part of this? So I'd break this up into 3 key areas. First would be an executive summary. You should have a section that's typically done in a collaborative text editor. Blameless has one within our retrospective section where someone can come in, read one paragraph, understand what the problem was, what was tried, ultimately what the solution was. The way I think about this is, you go into a bookstore, you pick up a book, you read the back of the book, you decide if you want to buy that book. The incident retrospective executive summary should be the same way. Someone in sales, as an example, should be able to come in here, read it, understand it, and be able to take that information and talk to their customer about what happened. The next piece is the technical details. So as I mentioned beforehand, what teams were involved? What were the mitigation steps? Were there relevant tags such as customers or products impacted, services impacted, your timing metrics? A lot of this information will be kind of curated automatically using a tool like Blameless, but it's important to make sure you're documenting as much technical information as you can. And then finally, answering questions like the culture questions, as I've kind of mentioned beforehand. Were the right Slack channels notified, or were the right user groups automatically updated? Did you have the right tools that were automatically being put into place during your process? Taking all this information and utilizing these answers to help you learn and improve upon is just as important as actually solving the problem. Learning is a big aspect when it comes to actually instilling this blameless culture. And again, kind of leading into my last slide here, is learning from every incident is just as important as solving your problem. In efforts to learn from every incident, you have to be comfortable with actually gathering that information. Maybe you're working out of Slack or Microsoft Teams and you want to add some information into the chat, but you just don't feel comfortable. That's where the culture part comes in. The worst thing that you could do is not speak up, because the answer that you put in the chat or on a Zoom call or something, that could be the answer to solving the problem. At least if you put it in there, it can be documented, you could learn from it, and allow the incident roles that Paul discussed earlier to ultimately decide what is important when it comes to actually saying, this helped me solve my problem. But again, getting the information down is just as important. Learning is just as important as solving a problem. So again, completing this blameless retrospective is your first step in learning from your incidents and taking these actionable next steps in order to improve upon. And speaking of next steps, we will get into poll question number 5. To what extent do you follow up on post-incident actions and tasks today? So just as I'm telling you, you should be following up, let's follow up with everybody here and see how you do this today. Give a couple seconds here. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Only for high severity incidents seems to be the most common answer to this question. Sometimes it depends. Speaking about action items, that's one of the hard parts about battling incidents is, you get so wrapped up in trying to solve the problem that oftentimes you forget what needs to be taken as a next step. So again, the retrospective is an area where you can come back and take a look at what did you have as those next steps and ultimately use them on like a sprint review call, something along those lines to say, hey, what did we do? What do we still need to do? And why did we actually have this information down? So, and speaking of next steps, I wouldn't be doing my job here if I didn't ask one more poll question as a kind of a follow-up action from our side, and just asking overall, how did we do today? Was this interesting to you? So you'll see one more poll question up here on the screen, but I'd like to personally thank everybody for coming today. We'll stop here with 5 minutes left to answer any questions that kind of may be lingering. But thanks again so much, and we'll get the answer to this last question here, and we'll go from there.
I do see a question. So in the security community, we have groups like OWASP. Is there anything analogous in the IM community? That's a great question. I actually came from the security space. So I know for security, there's a lot of organizations who really help define kind of what things you should be focused on. You could use some of the industry compliance to help with some of the hardening, so to speak, of your internal processes and documentation. But I think a lot of times, that's why methodologies like, DevOps and SRE exist, because I think one of the things that people kind of lose sight on is you're so focused on the actual application that you sometimes lose sight of the end user or the customer, right? What impact will this have on that end user? So one of the things there is, talk to your colleagues, right? Talk to your manager, talk to the person left of you virtually or right of you virtually, and just see kind of like, what their experience is. The beauty of the internet, as we all know, is that there's so much information out there. Attend your conferences too. We also want to help with these sort of workshops, but I think just having organic conversations will really help kind of provide, will really come to light where the gaps are, so you can at least start kind of little by little in terms of establishing that process. Probably not the best answer for you, Erasmus, but hopefully that helps. Well, any other questions?
We can stay on for another minute or so and answer questions. I also just want to make a housekeeping note that this webinar has been recorded. We will email you the recording tomorrow, and it will be available on our website in case you want to rewatch or share with any colleagues.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Okay. Thanks so much, everyone. We've loved having you.
Thank you. Take care.